I'm calling 911 right now to have you arrested for trespassing. That's what this HOA Karen yelled at me when I refused to leave my very own lakeside cabin. Victoria was absolutely sure she had the law on her side. She waved her clipboard around like it was a legal weapon, demanding I pack my things and get off what she called community property. When I calmly said, "No, I'm staying right here," she completely lost her temper and actually called the police. She was so convinced she was about to see me get dragged away in handcuffs. This woman thought she was just dealing with some random guy in an old cabin. She had no idea she was about to make the biggest mistake of her HOA career. Comment below if you think this Karen is about to learn a tough lesson. It's a perfect Saturday morning at Pine Lake. The mist is rising off the water, birds are singing, and I'm sitting on my little dock with my grandfather's special gold and bamboo fishing rod, just enjoying the quiet. This cabin has been in my family since 1987, and honestly, there's nowhere else I'd rather be. The water is as smooth as glass, reflecting the tall pine trees that give this place its name. My tackle box is right beside me, with all my fishing gear neatly organized. Life doesn't get much better than this. I was thinking about catching some bass for dinner when I suddenly heard the aggressive sound of high heels marching down my gravel path. That's when I first saw Victoria, though I didn't know her name yet. She stomped toward me like she owned the whole lake, clutching a bright red clipboard like it was some kind of weapon. She looked to be in her mid-50s, with that classic Karen haircut, you know, the one. She was wearing a blazer that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager." The look on her face told me everything I needed to know. This woman was on a mission, and I was her target. She didn't even bother with a friendly hello. She just marched right up to the edge of my dock and started talking as if she was reading from an official document. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a very condescending tone. According to HOA Resolution 15B, this lakefront area is for community use only. You need to remove your belongings and leave immediately. She held up that clipboard like she was serving me with legal papers. I almost laughed out loud, but managed to keep a straight face. I've learned that staying calm in these situations usually works out better for everyone. "I appreciate your concern," I told her with a polite smile, "but I'm staying right here." That seemed to surprise her for a second, like she wasn't expecting me to push back. But Victoria wasn't the type to give up easily. Her face started to turn red, and she puffed herself up like an angry bird. "We'll see about that," she declared, waving her clipboard around. "I have the authority to enforce HOA regulations, and I've done my homework. Every single property around this lake falls under HOA jurisdiction. You're trespassing on community property, and if you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have you removed by force." While she was talking, I glanced over at a sealed envelope sitting on top of my tackle box. It was marked Pine Lake, important in my grandfather's handwriting. Suddenly, that envelope felt much more important than it had 5 minutes ago. Just then, old Pete, a neighbor, walked by on his morning stroll. Pete's been living here for 35 years, since before all the new development started. He's seen it all and doesn't get rattled easily. As he passed behind Victoria, he caught my eye and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "She's barking up the wrong tree, son." Victoria spun around, but Pete just kept walking, whistling an old tune. You have to love the guy. He has more courage than most people half his age. Victoria glared at him for a second, then turned back to me with a triumphant look on her face. "See, even your neighbors know you don't belong here," she said, completely misreading the situation. I could see Pete shaking his head as he walked away, probably thinking about all the other Victorias he's dealt with over the years. She continued her tirade. "I've spent weeks researching the property records, the HOA bylaws, everything. This entire lakefront belongs to the Homeowners Association, and as the newly elected president, it's my responsibility to make sure these regulations are enforced. You can't just set up camp wherever you want and pretend you own the place." The irony of what she said wasn't lost on me, but I decided to let her finish her speech before I said anything. I stood up slowly, carefully set my fishing rod aside, and looked Victoria straight in the eye. There's something about staying calm when someone is yelling at you that really throws them off. "Ma'am," I said in my most respectful voice, "I understand. You believe you're doing your job, but I think there might be some information you're missing. This cabin has been in my family for decades, and I have every right to be here." She started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. However, since you seem so confident in your research, perhaps we should take a closer look at those property records you mentioned. That's when I picked up the sealed envelope from my tackle box and tucked it into my jacket pocket. Victoria watched me put away my fishing gear with a smug expression, probably thinking she had won. Finally coming to your senses, she muttered under her breath, but as I walked past her toward my cabin, I noticed something that made me stop. Almost hidden in the weeds near the shoreline was an old property boundary marker, one of those metal posts with numbers on it that surveyors use. The numbers were hard to see, but they were there. I made a mental note to take a closer look later, after I dealt with my unexpected visitor. Don't think this is over. Victoria called after me as I headed up the path. I'll be back with proper documentation, and next time you won't have a choice in the matter. I turned around and gave her one last polite nod. Have a good day, ma'am, I said, and I meant it. After all, everyone deserves a good day, even if their world is about to be turned upside down. As I watched her stomp back up the path, still clutching that red clipboard, I couldn't help but wonder how thorough her research really was. But what if Victoria's research wasn't as thorough as she thought? Drop a comment if you've ever dealt with an overzealous HOA president. Well, Victoria wasn't kidding when she said she'd be back. 2 days later, I was out on my dock again, same spot, same fishing rod, just enjoying another peaceful morning, when I heard a car door slam up by the road. This time, she had backup, not people, but paperwork. She came marching down with a huge folder and what looked like official notices printed on fancy paper. I told you I'd be back, she announced. Acting like a sheriff serving a warrant, she slapped a piece of paper down on my tackle box hard enough to make my coffee mug jump. It was a $2,000 fine for violating community standards, plus a 24-hour notice to leave the premises. I picked up the notice and gave it a quick read. It was impressive, I'll give her that. It looked very official with references to specific HOA bylaws, but here's the thing about paperwork, it's only as good as the authority behind it. This is quite elaborate, I told her, setting the paper aside. I can see you put a lot of work into this. That seemed to please her for about half a second until I continued. I've decided to have my attorney take a look at the situation. So I'll be sending him a certified letter outlining our discussion. The look on her face when I mentioned having a lawyer was priceless, like she'd just been slapped with a cold fish. Legal intimidation tactics, she shrieked. I should have known you'd try to lawyer your way out of this. Well, you can play at that game, buddy. I know people too, and I'm not going to be bullied by some squatter who thinks he can intimidate the rightful property owners. She was getting more and more worked up, pacing back and forth on my dock like a caged animal. I just kept fishing, which seemed to annoy her even more. There's something about sticking to your routine when someone is trying to disrupt your life that really gets under their skin. You think you're so clever, she continued, but I've got news for you. This is still America, and we have laws here. That's when things took a turn for the truly ridiculous. Victoria pulled out her phone and started dialing, making sure I could see exactly what she was doing. Yes, I need the police, she said in an overly dramatic voice. I have a trespasser on community property who's refusing to leave and is now threatening legal action against the homeowners association. She gave them my address, well, what she thought was my address, and made it sound like I was some kind of dangerous criminal hiding out in a bunker. The whole time she was talking to the dispatcher, she was staring at me like she was watching a cornered rat, probably expecting me to panic and pack up my things. About 15 minutes later, I heard sirens coming down the lake road. Two patrol cars pulled up, and I could see Victoria practically bouncing on her toes with excitement. She rushed up to meet the officers, pointing dramatically in my direction. That's him, that's the trespasser. He's been illegally occupying our community lakefront for weeks. The cops, 2 young officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, walked down to my dock with Victoria trailing behind them, still clutching that red clipboard as if it would somehow prove her right. Good morning, officers, I said, not bothering to reel in my fishing line. Beautiful day for fishing, isn't it? One of them, a tall guy with a mustache, nodded politely. Sir, we've received a complaint about trespassing. Do you mind if we ask you a few questions? I gestured to the bench beside me. Not at all. Would you like to sit down? Victoria looked like she was about to explode. Don't offer them seats. This isn't a social call. I want him arrested for trespassing on homeowners association property. The officers exchanged one of those looks that cops give each other when they realize they're dealing with a difficult person. The second officer, a shorter woman with sergeant stripes, opened her notepad. "Ma'am, we'll handle this, sir. Can you tell us your connection to this property?" That's when I reached into my tackle box and pulled out the sealed envelope I'd been saving. "Certainly, officer. I think this will explain everything." I carefully broke the seal. The envelope had been sitting there for 3 years, ever since my grandfather passed, waiting for the right moment. Inside was the original property deed from 1987, along with a handwritten note from my grandfather explaining the special agreement that came with the land. "This lakefront parcel remains exempt from all future homeowner association agreements," I read aloud from the legal document. "The property was grandfathered in when the HOA was established, and the owner retains all riparian rights and exclusive use of the shoreline, extending 50 feet in either direction from the cabin." I handed the deed to the sergeant, who studied it carefully. Meanwhile, Victoria stood there with her mouth hanging open, looking like she was trying to catch flies. The officer walked over to the old boundary marker I'd noticed earlier, brushed away the weeds, and confirmed that the property numbers matched the deed exactly. "Ma'am," the sergeant said, turning to Victoria with a professional but firm tone, "this gentleman owns this property outright. These documents are legitimate and properly recorded. You filed a false police report." Victoria's face went through about 6 different shades of red before settling on a color that looked like she'd been stung by a whole nest of hornets. "That's impossible," she sputtered. "I researched everything. The HOA has jurisdiction over the entire lakefront." The mustached officer shook his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the law is pretty clear on this. Grandfathered properties keep their original rights regardless of when an HOA is formed." The sergeant handed me back my deed and gave Victoria a look that could have frozen the lake in July. "Mum, filing false reports is a serious matter. We're not going to charge you this time, but I strongly suggest you verify your facts before involving law enforcement in civil disputes." Victoria looked like she wanted to argue, but even she wasn't foolish enough to keep fighting with the police after they had made their position clear. As the officers walked back to their cars, I called out to them, "Thank you for your professionalism. Officers, I hope the rest of your shift is quieter than this." Victoria stood there for a long moment after the police left, just staring at me, trying to figure out how her perfect plan had gone so terribly wrong. Finally, she found her voice. "This isn't over," she said, but all the fight had gone out of her. She sounded more confused than angry now, like someone had just told her the sky was actually green. "Maybe next time you'll check property records more carefully," I suggested, casting my line back into the water. She turned and walked away without another word, but I could practically see the gears turning in her head. What lengths will Victoria go to now that her first plan has backfired so spectacularly? "Tell me about the worst Karen encounter you've ever witnessed." If I thought Victoria would just quietly disappear after her humiliation with the police, I was dead wrong. Over the next week, I started noticing some strange things happening around my property. At first, it was small stuff. My fishing lines would be cut when I left them out overnight. There would be soap suds in the water near my dock, and someone kept moving my garbage cans around. I knew it was her, but proving it was a whole other problem. Victoria had apparently decided that if she couldn't get me evicted through official channels, she would just make my life miserable enough that I'd want to leave on my own. What she didn't realize was that I'd been dealing with difficult people for a lot longer than she'd been practicing her Karen act. The real campaign started when she took it online. I found out later that she had created an online group called Concerned Pine Lake Residents and was spreading all kinds of wild stories about me. According to Victoria's version of things, I was some kind of dangerous loner who was threatening the safety of the whole community. She posted photos of my cabin from weird angles to make it look rundown and scary, and she even made up stories about loud music and wild parties that never actually happened. The woman had a real talent for creative writing, I'll give her that. She was telling people I was an environmental hazard, polluting the lake and driving down property values. What really got under my skin was when she started pretending to be other people online. She created fake accounts, pretending to be long-time residents who were concerned about the new squatter. One of the accounts was supposedly old Pete, which was hilarious because Pete couldn't operate a computer to save his life, but the fake Pete was posting all kinds of worried comments about how the young man by the lake was making everyone uncomfortable. When the real Pete found out about this, he came storming over to my place, angrier than I'd ever seen him. "That woman's got some nerve," he growled, shaking his head. "Using my name to spread her poison, what's she going to try next?" The harassment escalated pretty quickly after that. Someone started parking cars in front of my driveway, always different vehicles, always with some excuse about why they had to block my access. My mailbox was accidentally knocked over twice in 1 week. Someone scattered garbage around my property and then complained to the county about my poor maintenance. It was like being attacked by a swarm of mosquitoes. Individually, none of it was serious enough to call the police, but altogether, it was clearly designed to wear me down. Victoria was playing a psychological game, and she was better at it than I had expected, but here's what Victoria didn't know about me. I've always been a very methodical person. While she was running around playing pranks like a middle school bully, I was documenting everything. I installed discrete security cameras around my property, not the obvious kind that screams surveillance system, but tiny ones that blended in with the landscaping. Within a week, I had hours of footage of Victoria and her little helpers creeping around my place in the middle of the night, cutting fishing lines, dumping soap in the lake, and generally acting like teenage troublemakers. It was actually pretty pathetic to watch a grown woman resort to such petty vandalism just because she couldn't handle being wrong. The breaking point came when Victoria managed to rally 12 residents to sign a petition demanding my removal for community safety. She presented this document to me on a Friday afternoon, clearly expecting me to be intimidated by this show of community opposition. The petition was full of dramatic language about unknown individuals and threats to our peaceful way of life. What made me chuckle was reading the signatures. Half of them were people I'd never even met, and the other half were folks who would probably sign anything Victoria put in front of them just to get her to leave them alone. Interesting signatures, I told her after giving the petition a good look. That's when I decided it was time to make a phone call. I pulled out my cell phone right there in front of Victoria and dialed a number I hadn't used in months. "Hi, this is Jake Miller," I said, making sure she could hear every word. "I need you to prepare the Pine Lake files. All of them." I paused for a moment, listening to the voice on the other end. "Yes, everything we discussed last year. It's time to move forward with the plan." Victoria was trying to pretend she wasn't eavesdropping, but I could see her leaning in to catch what I was saying. When I hung up, she tried to act casual, but I could tell her curiosity was eating her alive, making more legal threats. She asked, trying to sound dismissive but failing to hide the nervousness in her voice. I just smiled and folded up her petition, tucking it into my jacket pocket. "Just taking care of some business," I replied. "You know how it is. Sometimes you have to call in the professionals to handle complex situations." The look on her face told me she was already imagining all kinds of legal trouble heading her way. But what she couldn't possibly have guessed was that the Pine Lake files weren't about lawsuits or legal battles. They were about something much more fundamental. Over the weekend, I spent some time going through those old documents my grandfather had left me, along with some newer paperwork I had been collecting over the past few years. There were property surveys, purchase agreements, mineral rights documents, and a whole lot of other legal paperwork that painted a very different picture of Pine Lake than what Victoria thought she knew. As I sat there, organizing everything into neat piles, I couldn't help but think about how shocked she was going to be when she finally learned the truth. Old Pete stopped by on Sunday evening and found me surrounded by papers. "Looks like you're preparing for something big," he observed. I nodded and kept sorting the documents. "You could say that. I think it's time Victoria and the rest of the community got the full picture of what's really going on around here. What's in those Pine Lake files that has Jake so confident? Comment below if you think Jake is planning something big. Victoria wasted no time in calling an emergency HOA meeting for the following Thursday evening. She sent out notices to every resident around Pine Lake, describing it as a critical community safety meeting to address the ongoing trespasser situation. The way she worded the announcement, you'd think I was some kind of dangerous fugitive who had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months. She booked the community center, set up chairs for about 60 people, and even created an agenda that listed my permanent removal as the main item for discussion. I had to admire her organizational skills, even if her facts were completely wrong. I showed up about 10 minutes after the meeting started, carrying my leather briefcase and wearing the one decent suit I owned. Victoria was already in full presentation mode, standing at the front of the room with a PowerPoint slideshow about community standards and property protection. When I walked in, she stopped mid-sentence and pointed at me like I was an exhibit. There he is, the person who's been terrorizing our peaceful community. A few people turned to look at me, but most of them seemed more curious than hostile. I nodded politely to everyone and took a seat in the back row, setting my briefcase on the floor beside me. "You have no right to be here," Victoria declared, her voice echoing off the walls of the community center. "This is HOA business, and you're not a member of this association." I stayed quiet and let her continue her presentation, which was actually quite elaborate. She had charts showing property values, photos of my cabin taken from unflattering angles, and even a timeline of what she called my escalating antisocial behavior. It was like watching someone build an entire case based on a complete misunderstanding of the facts. The more she talked, the more I realized just how much work she had put into this crusade against me. Several residents raised their hands with questions, and most of them were pretty reasonable. An older woman asked about the police visit and whether any actual laws had been broken. A middle-aged man wanted to know if the HOA had consulted with a lawyer before taking action. Victoria deflected most of these questions, insisting that the community needed to take a stand before the situation got completely out of control. She was working herself up into quite a frenzy, pacing back and forth at the front of the room like some kind of TV preacher. "We cannot allow outsiders to intimidate legitimate property owners," she declared. That's when I decided it was time to join the conversation. I stood up slowly, picked up my briefcase, and walked toward the front of the room. Victoria immediately started objecting. "Security, someone call security. Remove this man from our meeting." But there wasn't any security, and nobody seemed particularly interested in removing me. Old Pete, who was sitting in the third row, actually chuckled and said, "Let the man speak, Victoria. This is America, last time I checked." Several other residents nodded in agreement, and I could tell that Victoria's aggressive tactics were starting to backfire on her. "Thank you," I said, setting my briefcase on the table next to Victoria's laptop. "I appreciate the opportunity to address some of the concerns that have been raised." Victoria was practically vibrating with anger, but she couldn't really stop me without looking completely unreasonable in front of the whole community. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a large, folded survey map, the kind that professional developers use for major projects. Victoria has done a lot of research about property ownership around Pine Lake. I began unfolding the map across the table. "But I think there might be some important information she missed. Don't listen to him," Victoria shouted. "He's just trying to confuse everyone with legal mumbo-jumbo." But people were already leaning forward in their chairs, trying to get a better look at the map I was spreading out. It was a detailed survey of the entire Pine Lake area, with every property clearly marked and color-coded according to ownership. Most of the properties were highlighted in blue, which, according to the legend, meant they were owned by Miller Holdings, LLC. The few properties that weren't blue were marked in red, indicating different ownership. "Actually, Victoria, I do have the right to be here," I said calmly, pointing to the community center's location on the map. "You see, I own the land underneath this community center, and your house, and most of the houses in this room." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop. Victoria's face went from red to white, to a sort of greenish color I'd never seen on a human being before. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice carried in the dead quiet room. I reached into my briefcase again and pulled out a stack of property deeds, all properly notarized and recorded with the county. Over the past 8 years, I've been quietly purchasing Pine Lake properties through various limited liability companies. Approximately 80% of the homes around this lake are built on land that I own, with residents holding long-term ground leases. I could see people frantically digging through their purses and wallets, looking for their own property documents. "These aren't traditional mortgages," I continued. "Most of you signed lease agreements when you bought your homes, probably without realizing what that meant. The room erupted in confused chatter as people started comparing their paperwork. "My lease agreement says Miller Properties." Someone called out from the middle of the room. "Mine too," shouted another voice. "Oh my God, mine says the same thing." Victoria stood there, frozen, watching her entire world crumble around her. She had spent weeks trying to evict someone who actually owned most of the community she thought she was protecting. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Victoria," I said, consulting my map. "Your house sits on lot 47, according to my records. Your ground lease expires in 14 months. I looked up at her with the same polite smile I'd been giving her since day one. "I'll be reviewing all lease renewals very carefully, taking into account each resident's contribution to community harmony and neighborly relations." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Victoria understood it perfectly. Her expression went blank, and she slowly sank into the nearest chair, still gripping that red clipboard as if it were the only thing grounding her in that moment. Old Pete started laughing first, a deep belly laugh that filled the room. "Told you she was barking. Up the wrong tree," he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "But I never imagined it was this big a tree." Other residents started laughing too, not with malice but with the kind of relief people feel when a tense situation suddenly becomes absurd. Victoria sat there in stunned silence, probably trying to figure out how she had gotten everything so completely wrong. The woman who had been terrorizing me for weeks because she thought I was trespassing on community property had just discovered that she was essentially my tenant. I packed up my maps and documents while people continued to process what they had just learned. Several residents approached me with questions about their lease terms, and I assured them that nothing would change for anyone who had been acting in good faith. "I'm not interested in disrupting anyone's life," I told them. "I just want to live peacefully on my property without harassment." As I headed for the door, I could hear Victoria behind me still muttering, "Impossible, impossible," like a broken record. The meeting broke up quickly after that, with most people heading home to examine their property documents more carefully. How will Victoria react when she realizes she's been attacking her own landlord? Drop a comment about the most satisfying plot twist you've ever seen. The transformation in Victoria after that meeting was something to behold. Within 24 hours, she went from being the self-appointed queen of Pine Lake to a complete social outcast. Word spread fast in a small community like ours, and people who had been afraid to oppose her suddenly found their courage. Residents who had been quietly enduring her tyranny for months started sharing their own Victoria horror stories. It turned out she had been bullying people about everything from lawn care to mailbox colors, always threatening HOA fines and community action. Now that everyone knew she had no real power, the mood around the lake shifted dramatically. Victoria didn't handle this reversal well at all. She started what I can only describe as a social media meltdown, posting increasingly frantic messages about local tyrants and threats to evict entire communities. She was spinning the story to make it seem like I was some kind of evil landlord who had tricked innocent families into signing predatory lease agreements. The problem with her story was that most of the residents actually had pretty good lease terms. I had structured the deals to be favorable to the tenants because I wanted stable, long-term occupancy. But Victoria wasn't interested in facts at this point. She was running on pure desperation and wounded pride. What I didn't know until later was that Victoria's extreme reaction to potentially losing her housing had deep roots. Old Pete filled me in after running into her former neighbor from Riverside Heights, the community she had been kicked out of before moving to Pine Lake. Apparently, Victoria had been evicted from 3 different places as a child when her family couldn't make rent. She had developed this obsessive need to control her living situation as an adult. Her aggressive HOA behavior wasn't just about power, it was about never feeling vulnerable again. Unfortunately, her methods for achieving security involved making everyone else feel vulnerable instead. She started trying to contact news stations, claiming she had a story about land grabbing and community intimidation. I heard through the grapevine that she had called at least 6 different local reporters, but none of them were interested in her version of events. It turns out that a story about a woman discovering she's been harassing her own landlord isn't exactly the David versus Goliath story she was trying to sell. The reporters who did respond asked basic questions about the legality of the lease agreements and the recorded property deeds. When Victoria couldn't provide any evidence of actual wrongdoing, they moved on to other stories. The stress was clearly getting to her. People reported seeing her at the grocery store muttering to herself and buying nothing but wine and frozen dinners. Her usually perfect appearance started to deteriorate. Her hair looked unwashed, her clothes were wrinkled, and she had a wild look in her eyes, like someone who hadn't been sleeping. A few of the more compassionate residents actually tried to reach out to her, but she rejected every attempt at reconciliation. She seemed to see any gesture of kindness as evidence of a conspiracy against her. That's when she started getting paranoid about my future plans. I was having a casual conversation with old Pete by the dock one afternoon, talking about some infrastructure improvements I was considering for the community. The utility situation should stabilize soon, I mentioned, referring to some upgrades I had been planning for the electrical grid. I've been working on some infrastructure improvements that should benefit everyone around here. It was just normal landlord stuff, making sure the community remained attractive and functional for all the residents, but Victoria, who had apparently been lurking behind some trees like a deranged spy, overheard part of our conversation and immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusions. She came charging out of the bushes like something out of a horror movie, her hair full of leaves and her eyes blazing with paranoid fury. "What utilities?" she demanded. "What's he planning? Are you going to cut off our power, our water? Is this how you're going to force us all out?" Old Pete and I just stared at her, not sure whether to laugh or call for professional help. "Victoria," I said as gently as I could, "I'm talking about improvements, not cutting anything off. I want to make the community better, not worse," but she was beyond rational conversation at this point. She had worked herself up into such a state that everything I said sounded like a threat to her. "I know what you're doing," she screamed. "You think you can just buy up everything and push out the people who built this community. Well, I won't let you destroy everything we've worked for." She was crying and yelling at the same time, which was both pathetic and genuinely concerning. The final confrontation came on a Sunday evening when I was enjoying a quiet sunset by the water. Victoria showed up at my dock, completely drunk and disheveled, swaying on her feet and slurring her words. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said, pointing an unsteady finger at me. "You think you can just steal people's homes and nobody will fight back?" I stood up slowly, concerned she might fall into the lake in her condition. "Victoria, you should go home and get some rest. We can talk about this when you're feeling better," but she wasn't interested in a reasonable conversation. "I'll burn this whole place down before I let you destroy our community," she shouted, loud enough for half the lake to hear. "People like you think you can just waltz in and take over everything, but I'll stop you. I'll find a way to stop you." She was becoming increasingly agitated, and I was starting to worry that she might actually be dangerous. Old Pete appeared at my side. He had heard the commotion from his house and had come to investigate. "Victoria," he said in his calm, grandfatherly voice, "you need to go home now. You're scaring people." She looked back and forth between Pete and me, tears streaming down her face, and for a moment I actually felt sorry for her. This was a woman who had built her entire identity around being in control, and now that identity was crumbling. "You don't understand," she whispered. "None of you understand. This is all I have. This is all I've ever had." Then she turned and stumbled back toward her house, muttering threats and curses under her breath. Pete shook his head as we watched her go. "She's dangerous now," he said quietly. "Desperate people do desperate things," I nodded, already thinking about the security precautions I might need to take. "What desperate move will Victoria make when she has nothing left to lose? Let me know if you think Victoria is about to do something truly crazy. I should have seen it coming." All the signs were there. Victoria's increasingly erratic behavior, her threats about burning the place down, her complete psychological breakdown after losing her perceived position of power. But even knowing she was unstable, I wasn't prepared for what happened at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. I was sound asleep in my cabin when the security system I had installed went off like a fire alarm. Motion sensors, perimeter alerts, the whole 9 yards. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feeds, and there she was, Victoria, creeping around my property in the dark like some kind of deranged burglar. She was carrying something in her hands, and it took me a moment to realize what it was, a gas can and what looked like a lighter. My blood ran cold when I saw her heading straight for my dock, where I had left my grandfather's gold and bamboo fishing rod propped against the railing. That rod wasn't just fishing equipment, it was one of the few tangible connections I had left to my grandfather, who had taught me everything I knew about patience, respect, and handling difficult people. The thought of Victoria destroying it in some twisted act of revenge made me angrier than I had been in years. I hit the emergency contact. On my phone, a direct line to the county sheriff's dispatch that I had set up when I first installed the security system. "This is Jake Miller at Pine Lake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have an intruder on my property attempting to commit arson. I need police immediately." While I was talking to the dispatcher, I saw through the live security feed that Victoria was behaving suspiciously near my dock, holding what looked like a fuel container and something in her hand that resembled a lighter. My heart sank. She appeared to be preparing to do something reckless. The woman had completely lost her mind. The police response time was incredible. It was less than 4 minutes from my call to the sound of sirens coming down the lake road. Victoria heard them coming and tried to run, but she was drunk and panicked and ended up tripping over her own feet. The officers arrived just in time and found her near the dock, visibly agitated and smelling strongly of gasoline. She was holding the same object I had seen on camera. Thankfully, no damage had occurred yet, and they intervened before anything worse could happen. Even in her deranged state, she had been specifically targeting the one thing she knew would hurt me the most. "He's stealing everyone's homes," she screamed as they cuffed her. "Someone has to stop him. He's destroying our community." The responding officer, someone I recognized from the first incident, gave her a firm but calm look. "Ma'am," he said, "we've documented enough evidence to take this matter very seriously." He explained her rights in a professional tone, and she was escorted off the property for further questioning regarding the incident. They had to physically carry her to the patrol car because she kept trying to break free and run back toward my cabin. Even as they drove away, I could hear her shouting about conspiracies and community protection. The trial took place about 6 weeks later, and it was quite a spectacle. Victoria's lawyer, a public defender who looked like he had drawn the short straw, tried to argue temporary insanity due to the stress of facing a potential eviction. He painted a picture of a woman driven to desperate measures by an intimidating landlord who was threatening her housing security. It wasn't a terrible strategy, actually, and it might have worked if the prosecution hadn't had such overwhelming evidence of premeditation and a clear intent to commit arson. Victoria took the stand in her own defense, which turned out to be a huge mistake. She spent 2 hours ranting about community values and property rights, claiming she was just trying to protect the neighborhood from a predator. The more she talked, the more unhinged she sounded. At one point, she actually told the jury that burning my property was justified because I was an outsider who didn't understand the community's needs. The prosecutor didn't even need to cross-examine her. She had basically convicted herself with her own testimony. But here's where things got really interesting. Just when I thought the case was over, my lawyer stood up and asked for permission to present one final piece of evidence. "Your Honor," he said, "there's something the defendant doesn't know that I believe is relevant to this case." He produced a stack of documents from his briefcase, all properly notarized and certified. Mr. Miller doesn't just own most of the land around Pine Lake. He also owns Pine Lake Utilities, the company that provides electricity, water, and internet to every home in this community, including the defendant's residence. The courtroom went dead silent. Victoria's face went through about 6 different expressions in the span of 2 seconds: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally, a kind of desperate fury. "That's impossible," she shouted, but her voice cracked. On the words, my lawyer continued calmly, "For the past 3 years, Mr. Miller has been subsidizing utility costs for all Pine Lake residents, keeping their bills 40% below market rate. The defendant has been attempting to drive away her own benefactor." That's when Victoria completely lost it. She jumped up from the defendant's table and started screaming at the top of her lungs. "No, this can't be happening. He can't own everything. It's not fair. It's not legal." The bailiff had to restrain her while the judge pounded his gavel for order, but Victoria wasn't done. "He's lying. They're all lying. This is a conspiracy to steal our homes." Security had to physically remove her from the courtroom while she continued shrieking about conspiracies and cover dash-ups. The jury deliberated for exactly 23 minutes before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. The judge sentenced Victoria to 18 months of probation, 200 hours of community service specifically focused on cleaning the Pine Lake shoreline, a restraining order requiring her to stay at least 500 feet from my property, and mandatory anger management counseling. He also ordered her to pay restitution for the property damage and the cost of the emergency response. Before the judge dismissed the court, he asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I stood up and looked directly at Victoria, who was staring at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "Your Honor," I said, "despite everything that's happened, I won't be pressing for utility disconnection or lease termination. Everyone deserves basic services and housing security, regardless of their behavior toward me. I hope Ms. Victoria can use this experience to learn something about community cooperation and mutual respect." Victoria's lawyer looked relieved. He had probably been expecting me to demand the harshest possible punishment. But Victoria herself looked like I had just slapped her across the face. I think she was so invested in seeing me as a villain that my gesture of mercy actually made her angrier than any punishment would have. As they let her out of the courtroom, she turned back one last time and shouted, "This isn't over, people. Like, you don't get to win," but it was over and we all knew it. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine peace. Victoria would be cleaning the shoreline where I fished every weekend, seeing me living quietly on my property and being reminded every week that her crusade had been based on complete ignorance. It was poetic justice in the truest sense, and probably the best possible outcome for everyone involved. Could this humbling experience finally teach Victoria a lesson about respect? Comment your prediction for how this story ends. The Saturday morning cleanup crew was quite a sight to behold. There was Victoria, dressed in an orange safety vest and carrying a trash bag, slowly working her way along the Pine Lake shoreline under the supervision of a county community service coordinator. The first time I saw her out there, I was sitting on my dock with my grandfather's gold and bamboo fishing rod, the same rod she had tried to burn, enjoying my morning coffee. When she noticed me watching, her face turned red with embarrassment and anger, but she couldn't do anything about it. She had to keep picking up litter while I sat there fishing in perfect peace. I made it a point to wave politely every time I saw her during those community service hours, not in a mocking way, but with genuine friendliness, the same way I would greet any neighbor doing work around the community. It drove her absolutely crazy. She would glance over occasionally with a cold expression, but chose to stay silent, likely aware that any outburst could complicate things further. The restraining order meant she had to stay 500 feet away from my property so she could see me but couldn't approach. It was like watching someone trying to argue with a person on the other side of a soundproof window. The transformation in the community atmosphere was remarkable. Without Victoria's constant drama and manufactured crises, Pine Lake became the peaceful place it was meant to be. Residents started talking to each other again instead of walking around in fear of HOA violations. People began taking evening walks around the lake, kids started fishing from the community dock, and folks actually seemed to enjoy living there. Several neighbors made a point of stopping by my place to apologize for not speaking up earlier when Victoria was harassing me. "We knew she was wrong," one woman told me, but she made it so unpleasant to disagree with her that it was easier to just keep quiet. Old Pete became my regular fishing companion during those Saturday morning community service sessions. He would bring his own chair and a thermos of coffee, and we'd sit there watching Victoria work while discussing everything from baseball to local politics. "Best entertainment I've had in years," he would chuckle as Victoria struggled to pick up trash along the rocky shoreline. "You know, I've seen a lot of bullies in my time, but I've never seen one get their comeuppance quite so thoroughly." Pete had a way of finding humor in everything, and his presence made the whole situation feel less awkward. The business side of things worked out better than I'd expected, too. Once residents understood that I was a reasonable landlord who actually cared about maintaining the community, several people approached me about home improvements and property upgrades. I discovered that my lease terms were far more generous than most of them had realized. I had structured everything to favor long-term tenancy and community stability. Property values around Pine Lake increased by about 15% over the next year, partly due to the peaceful atmosphere and partly because word got out about my infrastructure investments. Victoria herself underwent a gradual change during those months of community service. The manual labor seemed to have a therapeutic effect on her, though she would probably die before admitting it. By the 3rd month of her sentence, she had stopped glaring at me so intensely. By the 6th month, she was actually doing a decent job with the cleanup work, taking pride in keeping the shoreline looking nice. She never apologized or acknowledged that she had been wrong, but the manic intensity that had defined her behavior during our conflict seemed to drain away as the weeks passed. The anger management counseling apparently helped too. I ran into her counselor at the grocery store one day, and while he couldn't discuss specifics due to confidentiality, he did mention that Victoria was making significant progress in understanding how her childhood experiences with housing insecurity had influenced her adult behavior. It made sense when I thought about it. Her desperate need to control everything around her property had been driven by a deep fear of losing her home, the same fear that had haunted her since childhood. As Victoria's community service sentence neared its end, I found myself in an unexpected position. Several residents had approached me about the possibility of extending the shoreline cleanup program as a regular community activity. They'd seen how much better the lake looked after months of Victoria's mandatory labor, and they wanted to maintain that standard. I agreed to sponsor a voluntary monthly cleanup day with a small stipend for participants and a community barbecue. Afterward, to everyone's surprise, Victoria was one of the first to volunteer. When her court-ordered service ended on the final Saturday of her sentence, I did something that surprised even myself. As Victoria was finishing up her last bag of trash, I walked over to the 500-foot boundary line and called out to her. "Victoria," I said, raising my voice so she could hear me clearly. "I wanted to thank you for keeping our community looking so beautiful these past months. The lake has never looked better." She stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to figure out if I was mocking her. But I meant it sincerely. She really had done good work, even if it had taken a court order to get her started. That evening, as the sun was setting over Pine Lake, I sat in my usual spot with my grandfather's golden bamboo rod, thinking about everything that had happened. The water was like glass, reflecting the orange and pink sky, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the dock and the occasional call of a loon. This was exactly what my grandfather had envisioned when he bought this property back in 1987, a place where someone could find peace and quiet, away from the noise and conflict of the world. Grandpa always said, "The best fishing requires patience. Sometimes you wait hours for the right bite, and sometimes you wait years. But when someone tries to steal your fishing spot, well, that's when you show them who really owns the lake." I cast my line into the still water and settled back to wait for whatever might come next, knowing that sometimes the best victories are the ones where everyone learns something valuable in the end. Share this story if you believe karma always comes around, and tell me in the comments what's the most satisfying justice you've ever witnessed.